and roughly 7.3 million Israeli Jews. There is rough equality between the two sides. So the question is, how does Israel think about dealing with greater Israel, where you have rough equality between these two populations? And there are basically four options. One is you have a democratic greater Israel. That's not going to happen because it would no longer be a Jewish state. Okay, because if you look at demographic patterns, the Palestinians are making more babies than the Israeli Jews. So that's not happening. Second possibility is a two-state solution. Everybody loves to talk about a two-state solution. That is not happening, certainly after what happened on October 7th, but even before then, and I'll talk more about this. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli elite has no interest in a two-state solution, okay? The third possibility is apartheid, and basically what you now have is an apartheid state. We can go into this in detail in the Q&A if you want to do that, but if you look at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights group in Israel, all three of those organizations have produced lengthy reports that lay out why Israel is an apartheid state. The fourth option is ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing means getting rid of the Palestinians, for the most part, who live in Gaza and who live in the West Bank, and creating a greater Israel that is completely dominated by Israeli Jews and has very few, if any, Palestinians in its midst. So again, the four options are, number one, democratic greater Israel. Number two, two-state solution. Those two are off the table. Number three, apartheid, which is basically what you have now. And number four is ethnic cleansing, where you get rid of the Palestinians. Okay. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about what the situation looked like before October 7th. And focus mainly on Gaza. Before October 7th, the Palestinians in Gaza basically lived in a giant open-air prison. What happened was that in 2005, when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister of Israel, he decided to pull the settlers out of Gaza. As you know, there are settlers in the West Bank. Up until 2005, there were Israeli settlers in Gaza, and Sharon pulled them out. And he pulled them out because Gaza was a hornet's nest, and having settlers in there was a nightmare. And they had their hands full in the West Bank, and they wanted to focus on the West Bank. And what they did was pulled all the settlers out, and it became an open-air prison. Now, it looked up until October 7th like Netanyahu and company were able to manage the situation inside of Gaza. Nobody thought what happened on October 7th was going to happen. This is why the Israelis got caught with their pants down. They thought they were managing the situation very well. And what was going on there is that Netanyahu was actually very happy with the fact that Hamas was running Gaza. This is hard to believe today, but it is true. And he was making sure that Hamas was being funded and that Hamas was doing reasonably well. Now, why is that the case? Because Netanyahu is adamantly opposed to a two-state solution, and Mahmoud Abbas, who runs the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is in favor of a two-state solution. So from Sharon's point of view, not Sharon, from Netanyahu's point of view, would have been true from Sharon's point of view as well, as if he hadn't passed away, Abbas is a threat because Abbas wants a two-state solution. So what Netanyahu has done is supported Hamas, because we all know Hamas does not want a two-state solution, and he's playing off Hamas against the PLO in the West Bank. And it looks like it works. And by the way, every once in a while, every couple of years, the Israelis mow the lawn which means they precipitate a conflict with the Palestinians. They go in there, they kill hundreds, if not thousands of Palestinians, destroy some buildings, and send them a very clear message that, we're in charge and we want you to understand that you have to remain in this open-air prison. So that's the basic situation that exists. It looks like Netanyahu is managing the situation, and almost everybody thinks that, which is, again, is why they get caught with their pants down on October 7th. But again, what happens on October 7th is that Hamas attacks into Israel, and I think it's fair to say achieves a spectacular success. I think the evidence is that Hamas was surprised by how successful they were. And anyway, they eventually leave Israel, and the Israelis consolidate the situation inside of their borders. And then they eventually go on the offensive against Hamas. And that offensive is now taking place. Okay. Now, what we want to ask ourselves is, what exactly are Israel's goals here? This is very important to understand what Israel is trying to do. Now, if you read the mainstream media in the West, and this includes Australia, what people talk about is that Israel is interested in, number one, defeating Hamas. And here we're talking about decisively defeating Hamas and eliminating Hamas. And you can understand why, from Israel's point of view, that makes sense. The second goal is to get the hostages back. As you all know, Hamas took about 240 hostages, and what the Israelis obviously want to do is get those hostages back. So there's sort of two principal goals here: defeat Hamas decisively and get back the hostages. What's not discussed in the Western media is the real goal. And the real goal is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And the reason they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza is because, number one, that's the way you get out of apartheid. You all understand. Israel is an apartheid state, and the only way you get out of that situation is you cleanse. Furthermore, it's the only way you defeat Hamas. I'll talk more about this. It's quite clear that the Israelis are not going to defeat Hamas, right? And I can't believe they thought they would defeat Hamas before they went in there. They're too smart for that. But if you cleanse Gaza and you drive all the Palestinians out, you drive Hamas out. So you solve two of the principal problems you face with ethnic cleansing. You solve the apartheid problem, and you solve the Hamas problem. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, Israel wouldn't do anything like this. Just a couple points. First of all, to create the state of Israel, to begin with, you had to do massive ethnic cleansing. In 1948 and in 1967, the Israelis cleansed huge portions of what is today Greater Israel. And the idea that they wouldn't do this, if you read all sorts of Israeli media, they talk about ethnic cleansing all the time. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it. Final point I'd make to you is, one of the criticisms, and I'll talk more about this, of what the Israelis, and especially Benjamin Netanyahu, are doing in Gaza is they have not come up with a plan for what Gaza is going to look like after the shooting stops. In other words, what's the political solution here once the shooting stops? And Israeli military commanders, IDF military commanders, are constantly complaining these days that Netanyahu doesn't give them any sense of what the final political settlement's going to look like, so they can deal with Hamas and deal with the Palestinians with some thought in mind about what the end game is here. The reason there's no end game, the reason they're not...
Greatness is not a function of circumstance. Greatness, it turns out, is largely a matter of conscious choice and discipline. Jim Collins. Explanation: greatness doesn't depend on luck or situation, but is achieved through deliberate choices and consistent discipline.